That was a really good example of the parts of love that are patient and kind, and the parts of love that are, I need my mom, I think, too. That's a very familiar passage of Scripture. It is. I think for most people, in fact, it's probably one of those ones like John 3:16 where you can say 1 Corinthians 13 and people will know what you're talking about. And there's not a lot of those verses. It's like Psalm 23. Oh, I know what that is. And it's familiar. And that might be because you are a dedicated attender of church and you happen to be in church on the one Sunday every 3 years in which you're going to hear that. That Sunday's in January, by the way. Or it might be familiar to you because you remember it maybe from Sunday school or from youth group. It's most likely familiar to you because you were at a wedding recently. You might have even had it at your wedding, this read at your wedding. In fact, it has for a very long time been the go-to scripture passage for weddings. Or at least it kind of was until we kind of got to this point where people now like to have their wedding anywhere and not necessarily in a church. Thing is, though, quite often, what you might have instead is a poem or a song or some reading of some kind that echoes this passage of Scripture. Because it's about what love is. And see, that's great. That's great. Because when you're celebrating the love of two people, you've got people there supporting them. That's why they're there. You're celebrating their love, a love that is so strong they're willing to make a commitment to each other. I'm saying this all ideally, of course. That they're willing to make a commitment to each other. That's a moment in which love is present. You're talking about love. You want to talk about love. And that's a really good time to hear this passage of Scripture that reminds you that love isn't just happiness, romance, sex, good stuff. It's also these other things that are sometimes going to be work. They're sometimes going to be a challenge. It's a good time to remind you of that because we're in that moment of love. And that's awesome. And that is not even remotely why Paul wrote those words. Paul wasn't writing those words for people who were very much in love and living the love of Jesus. He wrote them to people who were not. See, we have all of these letters of Paul, and some letters attributed to Paul that he didn't write, but we're working on that. But we have all these letters because Paul went around, he toured around, and he helped people start communities around Jesus, the followers of Jesus, right? They'd gather together, they'd hear the stories, they'd learn the lessons, the teachings of Jesus, and they'd create communities around that. What will, at some point very much later in the future, become churches. And Paul helped people start that. And so every so often, of course, he'd hear about what's going on in some of those communities that he'd been to. And at some point, whether it was a letter from them directly or a communication from them directly in some fashion, or somebody he knew visited there and they came back and reported to him what was going on, he heard that the people in Corinth were struggling. Things were not going great. They were not living the love of Jesus. And so he wrote to them. And what we now know sort of consolidated into 1st and 2nd Corinthians was much more, probably much more than 2 letters. It was many, perhaps, that were then consolidated into these 2 things. Because why? There's so much good teaching in them about what it means, especially 1 Corinthians, about what it means to be community. This is the same piece of Scripture, by the way, that includes that wonderful example of how we are the body and how valuable each part of the body is. It's the same Paul who's writing about how we all have spiritual gifts. They're all different, but we all have spiritual gifts. This is the same Paul. And granted, Paul at other times says lots of stuff we might have some concerns about, but here's the moment in which he's writing to a community that is struggling, and they're struggling to live the love of Jesus in part because, well, they're a very diverse community. Corinth was a very cosmopolitan city. It's likely that that gathering of people around the teachings of Jesus would have included people from very different social and economic standing, different gender, different orientation, different abilities, in fact, pretty much everything that I said at the very beginning of the service when I said, "You are welcome here." That's the kind of community he was writing to. And they would hear these stories and teachings about Jesus and still struggle to live it out because of who they are. Perhaps not even initially understanding how important it is to share who they are and be open to who others are, because that's part of living the love of Jesus. And so Paul writes to them, and here's some of what he says. Love is patient and kind. It envies no one. It's not arrogant or rude. It's not just a beautiful piece of scripture for people who are very much in love. It's very much for people who aren't or who are struggling. People who are struggling to figure out how to love themselves and others. So Paul writes to them this beautiful and descriptive passage. This is what love is. And the thing about it is that it's not just about what love is from me to you. In other words, the outward expression of love. It's also very much about the inward expressions of love, our ability to understand and to hear and experience and feel other people and their lives. In fact, I would say, with all due respect to Paul, I think he maybe left a few things out. He certainly left out listening, which is something that is critical to sharing our stories, sharing who we are. Right now is a really good time to remind ourselves of that. Because it's not just about hearing stories of love, and it's not just about hearing stories of kindness and care. It's not just about that. It's about hearing the stories of hurt and brokenness and grief, and allowing that to become part of who we are in order that we might understand, in order that we might love together. In fact, one of the things that makes that so important is it is so much about who we, just who we are, but who we can become. Love isn't just an outward expression of ourselves. It's the ability to grow and open ourselves up to the experiences of life that strengthen and grow our love. Jan Richardson, not the Jan Richardson who's the minister in Stettler, Alberta, although also a lovely person. Jan Richardson is an artist and author who is famous for the Painted Prayer Book. She has a wonderful, very creative and artistic blog online, which you should very definitely follow. And she also has some books in print, which are very much worth getting. I happened across a short piece that she wrote about 1 Corinthians 13, in which she wrote this: "Loving is never just about opening our heart. It is about being willing to have our heart become larger as we make room for people and stories and experiences we never imagined holding. It is about being willing to have our heart become deeper as we move beyond the surface layers of our assumptions, our prejudices, and our habits in order to truly see and receive what and who is before us. It is about being willing to have our heart continually shattered and remade as we take in not only the brokenness of the world, but also the beauty of it. The astounding wonder that will not allow us to remain the same. I think it's so important to remember that. Because love isn't just us, it's all of us. It's the thing that connects us. It's the light that shines from within us, around us, and on all of us, and in all of us. It's the thing that brings us together. It's the thing that not only connects us, but makes us and remakes us and remakes us and with which we grow and become more fully who we are. Human and divine, but more. Love is more. That struck me particularly as being particularly important in a month in which we celebrate Pride, and we remember that not only are we celebrating Pride, but where that came from. It came from protest and struggle. We remember that protest and struggle is not done yet. We are still working on that. The same is true of National Indigenous History Month. We're still working on it, and we have a very long way to go. And we will make that journey best together. Together. And see, that's such an important thing, I think, to remember right now, because we are finding ourselves more and more in a society that drives to one side or the other. I'm sure I've talked more often than I should have before about how we find ourselves in a political and social and economic landscape that is far right, far left, and very few, if anyone, occupying that middle ground. It's almost like that middle ground has become a no man's land, in quotes. Not politically correct expression, but nonetheless, no one wants to occupy that ground, but that is where we need to be. Because it isn't just far right and far left. It's not that, it's not binary like that. We've learned that, right? It's either or. It's one or the other. We've learned that in a world where we constantly use expressions either or. Right? In a world where we confine ourselves then to those expressions as if those are the only two. There's a far right and there's a far left. In fact, we search high and low for ways to support our arguments for being one or the other. Here's the thing about an expression like high or low, high and low. When you say high and low, you don't literally mean the stuff that's on the top shelf and the stuff that's on the floor. You mean everywhere, right? It's not just one or the other. So why would we confine ourselves to either or and not try to be so much more inclusive in our lives? Why would we not want to embrace the more? Why would we not want to find a way into that more that connects us? we've learned from the very beginning, right? And today, in particular, this month, is a really good time to ponder in Genesis how God made male and female, and how often people will stick to that as therefore there must be only those two. But hang on. What if we understood less this and this, these two, and instead wondered at the inclusivity of all things, as those might be an expression of everyone, not just male and female? What about people who don't understand themselves that way? When that story starts, it begins with God created the light and the dark. But what about sunset and sunrise? What about twilight? What about as they move from one to the other? What about the more that we have reduced to those two things? I was thinking about that particularly this week because I came across a blog that then was post-Sky. The condensation and rain cycle refreshing our earth constantly. The sky, separate from water, contains and releases water. And appear. That isn't the full story either. Consider the marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens, not fully land, not fully waters. There is such glorious variety in God's creation. We see another binary in the celestial bodies God made. The greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And then, almost as a footnote, and the stars. There's more than just sun and moon in our outer space. Planets, asteroids, black holes, supernovas. Side note, these magnificent stars hundreds of times more massive than our sun, as simple as that to God. God created the great sea monsters and every winged bird of every kind, a split, again, between water and sky. Yet we see creatures like penguins that are definitely a winged bird, but do not fly and instead walk and swim. And finally, male and female, he created them. First off, intersex people exist. But, and perhaps more importantly, friends, look around you. Listen, do you have friends or family that say they don't fall under male or female? If so, honor that. Does all this variety invalidate God as creator? Of course not. I believe that this is instead an example of how authors weave words to tell a story. We see the author in Genesis give examples of the extremes that God creates. It doesn't exclude the possibility of more. And so we worship the God of more. The God of the marsh, the penguin, the God of the sunrise, the cloud, the supernovas, the God of the non-binary. You are loved. Love is more, because love is of God. When we live into the more, we experience life in a way that we simply cannot otherwise. We share love with others. We receive love. We honor their stories. We grieve with them. We celebrate with them. We honor who they are, and in doing so, we honor who we are. Made of love, divine and human. Loving beings.